Greetings, fellow ghouls, and thanks for stopping by on this snowy evening. As you can see, I've been decorating just a little for the holidays. You know I'm a big fan of Halloween, but I've actually always been quite partial to the Christmas season as well. It's a particularly cozy time here at Aberfoyle Manor, where I keep the fire glowing and the hot chocolate flowing. Well, say, since you're here, would you like to hear another true scary story from my collection? Yes, come, warm yourself by the fire, and I'll tell you the tale of the wrong voice. So, this story isn't actually mine, but it was told to me by someone else who is a very reliable source. In high school, I used to be on a rock climbing team. It was an alternative PE choice for any kids not interested in football or soccer, which, at the time, included me. The rock climbing coach was this older guy named Pat. He was maybe 50 or so, but his big bushy beard covered half his face and made it hard to guess his age exactly. And while I wouldn't call him mean, he was always deathly serious. I don't think I ever heard him laugh once. Coach Pat was very safety conscious and always made us practice our climbing knots and other procedures multiple times in a row. One day, he caught someone climbing on our indoor rock wall with an improper rope setup, and he chewed them out in front of the entire class for 15 solid minutes. They didn't mess up again. Not long into the program, I realized that Coach Pat's attitude towards safety was born out of his own personal experience. On his right hand, Coach Pat was missing 2 fingers, his ring and middle fingers. Both were nothing but small stumps that didn't even reach the first joint. Apparently, when he was in his 20s, he had been climbing outdoors and gotten his hands stuck in a crack at the same time that he lost his footing. He fell with his fingers stuck, ripping them clean off. Anyway, all this to say, he was a serious guy. So when he told us this story, I took it seriously. One night, Coach Pat and the rest of us from the rock climbing team were actually all seated around a fire deep in the woods. It was the last night of one of our rock climbing/camping trips. We had all shared our own scary stories and began begging Coach Pat to share one of his own. Eventually, he obliged. When he was younger, Coach Pat had been on a caving trip in West Virginia, spending some time in the woods with 2 of his friends and checking out a number of cave systems in the area. Their home base was this little campsite and was also a place to park their vans. It had a small cabin with 2 public restrooms in it. The cabin was on the edge of the clearing, right up against the dense forest that completely surrounded the area. Now, I don't recall the name of the cave system, but I remember Coach Pat telling us about the various features of the cave, including one extremely tight passageway affectionately nicknamed the Birth Canal. Coach Pat and his friends had to make their way through this area by sliding on their stomachs through it, and he compared it to crawling under a bed. At one point, the walls of rock were so tight that his helmet got stuck, and his friend had to help dislodge it. I don't know about you, but just the idea of being stuck in a passageway like that makes me feel intense dread. I'm not a particularly claustrophobic person, but getting squeezed on all sides by cold rock sounds like an absolute nightmare. There was another section of the cave that was a small tunnel that went down and then back up again. I guess it had rained recently, so the low part of the tunnel was actually underwater. Pat and his friends had to momentarily hold their breath and go underwater to come up on the other side and make their way through this tunnel. Like I said, Coach Pat was hardcore. Then he told us about something strange that happened in the cave. He said that at one point he was in a larger chamber with his two friends. Pat was in the middle, with one friend a few paces ahead of him and the other friend a few paces behind. As they rounded a corner, following the path near a large rock face, Pat heard his friend call his name from behind. He turned around quickly, his headlamp illuminating the cold darkness, but no one was there. He turned back around, looking ahead to see both of his friends in front of him. It was so strange. He had thought that he was in the middle of their underground procession. He was sure of it, in fact. But it was dark, disorienting, and in the middle of a bigger chamber like that, it was easier to lose your bearings. Pat could accept that maybe he'd gotten mixed up, but then, who had said his name from behind? Maybe his friends up ahead had called his name, and it had just echoed off the uneven rock walls and sounded like it was coming from behind. Pat called ahead to his friends and asked if they'd just said his name. However, they seemed confused and assured him that they hadn't. As they exited the large chamber, Pat looked back into the darkness one more time, the movement of his headlamp making countless dancing shadows out of the rocks and their irregular shapes. It was an easy place to become disoriented, he thought. He had probably just been hearing things. And yet, it had sounded so real. He thought once again about the voice, trying to replay it back in his mind. There had been something off about it. It almost sounded like someone talking with their mouth full of water, like knowing the sounds to make, but not quite being able to make them. That was silly, he thought. The cave was full of strange sounds. The dripping bats, the sounds of his friends' boot steps on the rocks. It was best just to finish spelunking and forget any thoughts of disembodied voices or other such nonsense. Coach Pat and his friends made their way through the rest of the system, squeezing through the last narrow tunnels and eventually re-emerging into the sunlight. They congratulated themselves and took a photo by the cave entrance by setting the timer on their camera. They spent the evening at the campsite, getting their van packed up and then relaxing outside under the stars. There were only a few other people at the site, and everyone was pretty much keeping their distance from one another. Sometime around 11, it started to rain lightly. Not a refreshing warm rain, but a cold early winter rain. Coach Pat and his friends turned in relatively early that evening, preferring to prepare for their early departure in the morning. Before going to sleep, Coach Pat decided to use the public restroom on the other end of the campground. He strapped on his headlamp and made his way over to the small restroom alone. While walking over in the darkness, Pat noticed that the few other campers at the site all seemed to be asleep, the embers of their reverie quelled by the frigid precipitation. Whatever lights they had been using were all off. Suddenly, Pat's headlamp began to flicker. Oh no, he thought. It's all out of battery from using it so constantly in the cave. For a moment, the light cut out completely, enveloping him in the dark void of night. There was a dim light on at the public restroom, but that seemed so far away. Pat then remembered the red light mode on his headlamp, a feature that saved some battery. Though the full white light was flickering, he flipped the switch to red light mode, and the lamp reignited, only this time in a much less powerful red glow. Though it didn't cut through the rural darkness quite as well, it did allow him to see where he was stepping, and he made it the rest of the way to the cabin. Pat turned into the open doorway of the small cabin, rounding a corner and heading into the men's side, the red glow revealing a minimal restroom before him. A dirty, rusty sink with a low toilet beside it, and a grimy shower stall in the corner. Countless spiderwebs decorated the old wood of the interior, with many multi-legged creatures seeming to have made this their home from the elements, Coach thought, as the rain tapped on the cabin roof. Once again, the movement from his headlamp made the shadows swing back and forth on the wall, only this time in an ominous red hue. After finishing in the bathroom, Pat turned to leave when he heard a noise. He froze in place, listening intently. Leaves. Crunching. Someone was walking around on the backside of the cabin. Pat figured it was maybe one of the other campers or even one of his friends. The footsteps circled the cabin, moving strangely slowly. Pat remained still as they approached the front of the cabin, the sound rounding the corner into the restroom, but there was nobody there. Pat walked towards the corner, confused, but then heard the footsteps on the other side of the cabin, the women's restroom side. This made him relax a bit. Both of his friends were men, so it must have just been another camper at the site. Pat gathered his toothbrush and whatever else he brought with him and went to leave. The shuffling continued on the other side of the wall. Someone was in there. After he was a few steps away from the cabin, back outside in the cold rain, he stopped, turned back, and looked at it. There was no light on the women's side, and that was odd. Someone was using it in the dark? Just then he thought of something. Why had the footsteps come from the back of the cabin? That wasn't the direction of any of the other campers. That was the direction of the wilderness. Why would someone have been coming from there? Suddenly, a voice called out from the cabin. It only uttered a single word. "Hello." It rang out from the other side of the wooden structure, echoing in the night over the sound of the rain hitting the leaves. Pat's blood ran cold. The voice sounded strange, but also familiar. It was the voice from the cave. That voice that just seemed wrong. He didn't know who or what it was, but there was no way he was going to stay and find out. He turned and marched all the way back to his van, where he found his friends fast asleep. It wasn't them messing with him. It was real. Anyway, Coach Pat never told his friends about it, not wanting to seem crazy, and knowing that they wouldn't believe him. And yet, as me and the rest of the climbing team sat around the campfire that night, we all did believe him. Later, after our rock climbing/camping trip had ended, Coach Pat showed us a photo in his office. It was the photo from his trip, with him and his two friends standing at the mouth of the cave. A nice memory, perhaps, but whenever I saw it, I couldn't help but stare into the gaping chasm of darkness behind them and wonder what could have been in there with them. Ooh, another twisted tale of terror from my collection. That was a pretty scary encounter, but it's a good thing that Coach Pat didn't cave into his fears. It makes sense that someone so safety-conscious would choose to just get the hell out of there, though. Who knows what might have been lurking in that bathroom in the middle of nowhere? Honestly, a bathroom in the middle of nowhere is scary enough already. Have you ever seen anything strange in the woods? Had a bizarre encounter? Or heard something you couldn't explain? Do let me know in the comments below. I'd say it's about time you get going. I have some more decorating to do, and the storm outside only seems to be getting worse. No, really, you should leave. You wouldn't want to get stuck here, right? Do come back again and visit sometime, maybe even before the holiday. and I'll have another twisted tale of terror waiting for you. Good night.